was shot down by the Iranian regime, claimed the lives of 176 people, including 57 Canadians and many, many, many permanent residents of Canada. They're also reminding the government of Canada that the IRGC is responsible for terrorism across the Middle East, is a huge part of the Iranian regime's forces, and is being currently used to oppress the people of Iran who are fighting for their freedoms. The second petition, Mr. Speaker, is on behalf of, again, like I said, constituents in my riding who are calling upon the Minister of Finance to suspend the federal excise tax and carbon tax for Canadians until the cost of living crisis has been resolved. They are again reminding in their petition to the government of Canada that the price of gasoline is way up all across the country, that the clean fuel standard will cost the average family over $1,300, that mortgages are going to be costing about $7,000 more in the new year, and that the average cost for the family, because of the inflationary spending of this government, will be another $3,000 upon them. So they're asking the government to cut the carbon tax and the excise tax on fuel, home heating, and their groceries. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting the petitions, Petitions, the honourable member for Courtney Alberni.
Okay. Mr. Speaker, it's no surprise I'm now tabling a petition on the firefighter tax credit. Firefighters, Mr. Speaker, as we know, especially in rural communities, put their lives on the line. And petitioners from my riding of Courtney Alberni, from Courtney, Cumberland, Royston, Dashton, Dashwood, Parksville, Qualicum, Beaver Creek, Cherry Creek, Sprout Lake, they've all signed this petition, Mr. Speaker. They're calling for the tax code of Canada that currently allows a volunteer firefighter and search and rescue volunteer to claim a $3,000 tax credit to if they do 200 hours of volunteer services completed in a calendar year, to be moved to $10,000. So they're calling on this action to take place. I think it's something that hopefully all of this House would support, and I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to table this petition.
Présentation de pétition, presenting a petition, the honourable member for Edmonton Riverbend.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And just one petition today, this one from 136 esteemed Canadians who have recognized that there are a number of issues when Ukrainians come to Canada. So they are calling upon the federal government to do the four following things: develop a federal program to bring Ukrainian children to Canada for temporary shelter, ensure they have access to the necessary medical services via provincial insurance programs, ensure they have access to education services, scholarship in Canada, and finally, ensure necessary financial support for Canadian families hosting those children. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presenting of petitions, présentation of pétition. Very good. Questions on the order paper. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I would ask that all questions be allowed to stand at this time, please.
Understood. Orders of the day.
Orders of the day, ordre du jour, ordre émanant du gouvernement, travaux.
Government orders, business of supply, study of an opposition motion on the carbon tax on behalf of Mr. Berthold.
Today is the final allotted day for the supply period ending December 10, 2022. The House will now go through the usual procedures to consider, is this the right stuff? Okay. Consider and dispose of the supply bill in view of current recent practices. Do honourable members agree that the bill be distributed now? Agreed? Agreed. Okay. There we go. Monsieur Berthold, appuyé.
Mr. Berthold, seconded by Mr. Barlow, moves that given that one, Canada's Food Price Report 2023 states that a typical farm will pay $150,000 in carbon tax per year when the carbon tax is tripled.
2, families will pay an additional $1,065 for groceries in 2023 for a total of $16,288 due to increased costs being passed on to consumers. 3, food bank visits were at an all-time high, reaching 1.5 million in March of 2022, a 15% increase from the previous year, according to Food Banks Canada.
4, 20% of Canadians are skipping meals, and grocery price inflation is at 11%.
Government to cancel the carbon tax that is applied on all food inputs and production, including A, all farm fuels, B, grain drying, C, fertilizer, D, transportation, and E, other appropriate aspects of the food supply system. L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Mégantic-l'Érable. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on December 8th, it might be a historical day. It's a big day for all Canadians because today the House of Commons has a unique opportunity to give some respite to all Canadian consumers that are suffering from inflation, the higher cost of living, the higher cost of food prices, by doing something that is fair. And I am full of hope and optimism that all my colleagues here in this House will finally, this time, do the right thing and vote in favor of our motion to get rid of the carbon tax on everything related to the food supply chain, Mr. Speaker. We're offering all members of this House a unique opportunity to do the only right thing, to give a bit of a break to all Canadians. This motion aims to set things right for Canadians that are having a hard time putting food on the table, Mr. Speaker. We've asked for this on many occasions. We've asked for it. We have begged the government and the other parties to support such a motion to reduce the carbon tax, or at least not increase it. But this time we're going even further. We're asking them to remove it on essential needs for the population, namely on food. So this is a day that could be memorable, that Canadians will remember from some time, because there may be parties that will vote in favor of this motion to give Canadians a break. Mr. Speaker, let me say something from the onset. I know there'll be questions. Members, probably from the government, will say, Mr. Berthold, why? Well, they won't say Mr. Berthold, they won't, because I can't say my name, but they will say, why did this member from Mégantic-l'Érable rise and to ask for the abolition of the carbon tax while the carbon tax doesn't apply to Quebec? Mr. Speaker, I'd like to remind the members across the aisle that Quebec is not self-sufficient in terms of oil, food, or the supply chain. Quebec has to get its supplies from across the world, and particularly across the country. Food that we bring from Western Canada, potatoes from the Atlantic coast, have to be transported by truck. And unfortunately, there is a carbon tax that applies to all of these products, and it will increase in the coming years. So this is the reality. And given this, if we deny this, we deny the reality that Quebecers right now they're the most affected by the rising cost of foods. And according to the last food price report presented by Dalhousie and BC University and Saskatchewan University, we're talking about 11% increase in groceries. And Quebec is still the only province that does not pay the carbon tax, as the Liberals will say, even though I have just shown that this is not, it is ridiculous to say this. Another thing, Mr. Speaker, the carbon tax will hurt farmers in Western Canada, who will have to pay higher tax bills that keep skyrocketing, and that will probably lead to bankruptcy in coming years if nothing is done, if the government doesn't do what is fair and abolish the carbon tax. What will happen if we have fewer farmers in Western Canada to provide food to Quebec and elsewhere? We'll have to take our supplies from even further away. We'll have to pay even more for the same food. And if we get our supplies from further, well, then we'll have to spend even more.
So this will be thwarting the efforts of the carbon tax, because we know full well, Mr. Speaker, that with the carbon tax, the government has not achieved any of its objectives when it comes to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Mr. Speaker, I don't want to talk about what's happening out west, because my colleague from the riding of Foothills, with whom I'll be sharing my time, will be telling you about the impact of the carbon tax on Western provinces. But where are we at today? What's the status? When we read to titles from the newspapers like this, the next few months will be very difficult. Cruel effects. We're talking about the rising interest rates, and we saw that from the Bank of Canada yesterday. All of that combined with the rising cost of food, Mr. Speaker, that I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about. And that is very well outlined in Canada's Food Price Report of 2023. But before doing that, I'd just like to point something out. In an article by Mr. Michel Girard in the newspaper this morning, the next few months will be very difficult. And I'd like to just quote a paragraph. Whose fault is it? And I'd have to take off my glasses because the type is very, very small. But according to Jean-François Perrault and others from the Bank of Nova Scotia, government expenditures for COVID support programs forced the Bank of Canada to aggressively hike interest rates. And support to victims of COVID is some $2 billion. That was welcome, but it is probably exaggerated. This caused an increased demand, and the bank is trying to slow that down. Now, it was, like they said, things needed to be done. But once again, what we're seeing is that the Liberals weren't rigorous in their approach. This is what the Auditor General said as well. They wasted, they overspent, and as a result, today, we are facing rising inflation. The Bank of Canada hiked the interest rate, and at the same time, Mr. Speaker, if everything goes up, if inflation goes up, well, it's hardly surprising to see the cost of food going up. In the report, the annual report, fish has gone up by 10%, butter 16%, fresh pasta, dried pasta. Now, historically speaking, back in the day when we studied, when we were in school, we couldn't afford food. What did we buy? We bought pasta. We ate pasta 5 days a week. On the weekends, instead of eating spaghetti, we ate macaroni for a change. So, Mr. Speaker, the cost of pasta went up 32%, so it's hardly surprising to see that students who can't afford housing, they have to live in their basements, their parents' basements, and that they're also having trouble buying food. The government has created inflation. This is inflation that could be called liberal inflation. We're facing higher costs of everything going up. In the report, they stated that in 2023, food prices for the average family of four would go up, would be some $14,000. Now, what they're seeing in 2022 is that it will be a $455 increase. And what that means is that next year, the average increase in the cost of groceries will be $1,065 for a family of four. That is huge. And as I was saying, Quebec has been the hardest hit by this rise in the cost of food. And in Quebec, according to the report, it's an 11% increase. But across Canada, it ranges between 9.2% and 11% over the course of a single year. I don't know many people who've seen salary increases of that range, and who can afford to buy what they need. And this is just food costs. I'm not talking about housing, about mortgages, about additional costs that people will have to face for their car loans, for example. It is ridiculous when we look at the rising costs facing consumers in Canada. What's worse, according to the report for the Canada Food Bank, Food Banks Canada, there's been a 15% increase. Canadians are facing a lack of accessibility because of the rising cost of foods. 23% of them eat less than they should in Canada. This is 2022, Mr. Speaker. This year, during the summer, there was a sharp rise in demand. There hasn't been a rise at food banks, but they've had to go through the most difficult times in the past 41 years, Mr. Speaker, and that's at the food banks. The government needs to take action. Parliament needs to take action. This House can take action, and we can do something here today by voting in favor of our motion, our opposition motion that calls for the carbon tax on food products, including farm fuels, grain drying, fertilizer, transportation, and other appropriate aspects of the food supply system, be cancelled to enable Canadians to put more food on their tables. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm all of a sudden craving Kraft dinner here. I'm not sure why. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Hull-Aylmer. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to congratulate my colleague opposite for having finally acknowledged to a small extent that there's a problem with the environment, that pollution, that there is a tarification and pricing on pollution. Now, I have a question for him. He talked about prices for goods. Does he think that pollution should be free, or that we should put a price on pollution? Should people just be allowed to pollute without any consequences? Or should we be saying, well, the more you pollute, the more you should pay? The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, the carbon tax simply isn't working. It's not working. All it's doing is taking money out of the pockets of Canadians, puts it into the government coffers, but it doesn't enable the government to meet any of its targets. Now, there's an international conference that was held recently where the performance of the various countries was assessed, and you know where Canada ranked with this price on pollution? This tax, this carbon tax? 58th out of 663 countries, 58th position. That's where Canada ranked, 58th out of 63 with the Liberal carbon tax. They're not doing much to help the environment. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I ate pasta in CEGEP as well. Now, I appreciate my colleague from Quebec. It's always good to work with him, but I agree with him on this, that when it comes to protecting the environment and dealing with greenhouse gas emissions, the government is failing. They're the dunce of the class. So we were 58th out of 63 countries. What does that mean? They're going to allow larger polluters and emitters to pollute even more? One thing that the Conservatives never do when they talk about getting money where it needs to come from is this. Do they question the fact that large petroleum companies are recording record profits this year and we're not going to get this money to distribute it to our people? I've never heard a Conservative say, well, how is it that these large oil companies are raking in record profits? I'd like my colleague to answer that. The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Well, Mr. Speaker, I went to buy groceries with my wife last week, and I went up and down all of the aisles. When I saw that the cost of everything that had gone up, I really asked some questions. How are we going to enable families to afford these cost increases? Now, look at lettuce. It's gone up by 12%, Mr. Speaker. That's what they're saying, but it went from 98 cents to $7 a head. Mr. Speaker, people can't even afford to eat vegetables. Imagine when it comes time to buying meat with these increases. It's essential for us to give Canadians a break. We need to focus on what Canadians need now, what they need now, putting food on their tables so that they can eat and satisfy their hungry. We can help them immediately by putting an end to the carbon tax on everything that's part of the food supply chain. And I'd like to invite my Bloc colleagues to think about that. Questions and comments?
Skeena Bulkley Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my friend from Mégantic-L'Érable for his speech. I would offer that the impact on food prices from the climate crisis and from the price gouging of the big box stores and big grocery retailers far outstrips the impact of carbon pricing. But my question is this. When farmers across this country are facing massive crop failures, when the infrastructure needed to ship our food is being ripped out by climate disasters, why do the Conservatives not have a plan to tackle the climate crisis, the most significant crisis facing us as a population? Why do they refuse to come up with a credible plan?
Hear, hear. Good question.
The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for his question, but I think there are some facts that he's not aware of. Now, in Canada, we've had the third best harvest in the history of the country. Despite all of that, when we're putting more and more products on the market, and we should be seeing a reduction in the prices for consumers. But that's not happening because despite the third best harvest in history, prices are higher than they were. They're the highest they've been in 40 years. So there's a problem, Mr. Speaker. It's caused by the carbon tax, the Liberal carbon tax, and we're calling on them to give Canadians a break, to give farmers a break across the country.
Reprise de débat.
Resuming debate.
Debate, the honourable member for Foothills.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague from Mégantic-Lorab to table this opposition motion today, as it shows our farmers, producers, ranchers, as well as consumers across Canada that the Conservative Party certainly understands about food security and their economic viability. In my opinion, the Liberals have a stark decision to make in the next few months. Their one decision is to continue on this activist, ideological agenda, increasing carbon taxes and taxes on producers, or start to understand that food security and the cost of food should be a priority for all Canadians. For a government that likes to, pride itself on making science-based decisions, clearly the policies they are putting forward are not based on sound science. But what is stark, and what was really the impetus of this motion, Mr. Speaker, is when we saw the new 2023 food price report that showed by 2030, when the carbon tax is going to be tripled by the Liberals, that a 5,000-acre farm, which is not a large farm by any means, as a typical farm, is going to pay $150,000 a year in carbon taxes. I would ask the government, how do they possibly think that a farm family is going to absorb that cost and still be able to produce affordable, nutritious food, not only for Canadians, but to help feed the world? How do they possibly feel a farm family can absorb $150,000 a year in carbon taxes alone and still remain economically viable? Incredible. They can't. They simply cannot. And that is the stark reality that the Liberal government needs to understand sooner rather than later. That when they make these extreme ideological policies, there are consequences. As part of that food report, it also stated that the average family of four will see their grocery bill go up more than $1,000 a year, to a total of close to $17,000 a year for a family of four in 1 year alone. The consequences of that, as we saw in March, that 1.5 million Canadians were accessing a food bank, the highest in our history. I can't believe this is happening in Canada, a G7 country, when we are unable to feed our own people, when food security in our own country is at risk. Now, as my colleague said in response to the block question, that we did have the third best harvest in our history this year. So why, if we have such a great harvest, are we talking about food insecurity and talking about the economic viability of our farms at risk? Well, when you have a large harvest, the issue is if your input costs are far exceeding the value of that crop, you are further behind at the end of the year rather than being ahead. And at committee on yesterday, we had Rebecca Lee, the Executive Director of the Fresh Produce and Vegetable Growers Association of Canada, say 44% of their members are selling their products at a loss. Almost half of the produce growers in Canada are selling their products at a loss. They can't afford the massive increases in fertilizer costs. They can't afford the massive increases in fuel costs. So how long does the Liberal government suspect that these farmers are going to stay in business? And if they go out of business, you know what happens? We have to import more of those foods from other countries around the world. What does that do to our GHG emissions? What does that do to their climate change philosophy and policies? We had Dr. Sylvain Charlebois at committee, also one of the most respected food scientists in the country from Dalhousie University. And I'm paraphrasing a bit, but he basically said the carbon tax, and he'll quote this part, the carbon tax is a bad idea. The carbon tax is putting farms out of business and putting our food security at risk. That's one of the top food scientists in Canada. So the carbon tax is a bad idea. And we're losing farms as a result of that. When we lose farms, food prices go up. When food prices go up, food security is an issue. And as a result of that, we see what's happened with more and more Canadians having to use a food bank. But there's more to that as well. And this is, I think, where the Liberals are missing the point when we make these decisions that are not based on sound science and data. For example, we asked the Minister of Agriculture at committee yesterday, why are you imposing these massive carbon tax increases on Canadian farmers when we're already more efficient than any other country on earth? For example, the data shows that out of Canada's total GHG emissions, which is about 2%, 8% of that comes from agriculture. 8% of 2%. That's infinitesimal on the global scale. The global average is 26%. That is a stark contrast for where we are compared to the rest of the world. So why is the Liberal government not celebrating those achievements by Canadian agriculture? Instead of punishing them with massive increases in carbon taxes, which is going to have a profound impact on food security in Canada, why are you not saying to the rest of the world, or why is the government not saying to the rest of the world, you know what, you want to reduce your GHG emissions from agriculture? We're already there. We'll show you how to get there. Use our technology, use our practices. We'll export our manufacturing. We're already using zero-till. We're already using cover crop. We're already using precision agriculture. We manufacture air drills in Canada that we're happy to export to you for other countries to use in their production. For our nutrient stewardship. All of these things we're already using in Canada. But they seem to be ignored by this government. And we asked the minister yesterday, how do you expect a family farm to absorb these types of costs? And her answer said, well, I don't understand what your definition of a family farm is.
What? Really?
You're the Minister of Agriculture. If anyone should know what a family farm is, it's the Minister of Agriculture.
Shameful.
And what makes that worse, Mr. Speaker, is the Liberals put forward Bill C-8, which had a rebate for farms in the carbon tax. We know from the Ontario Grain Farmers Association that their membership get about 15% of what they spend on the carbon tax. Finance Canada said the average payback through C-8 for a farm family is about $860. Put that in comparison to $150,000 what they're going to be paying. And they're going to get $1,000 back? And the Minister of Agriculture doesn't understand that. She's saying, well, it's the family's going to get that back, but the farm is a business. 95% of farms in Canada are family farms, owned by the family. Yes, they may be incorporated, but it's a family farm. You can't separate one from the other. That's why we put forward our private members bill, C-234, which would remove the carbon tax from natural gas and propane to help with grain drying, heating of barns, and those operations which are integral to the family farm. And Mr. Speaker, we have the support of all the opposition parties on that private members bill, the Bloc, the NDP, and the Greens. So the opposition understands how important agriculture is to the Canadian economy and our food security, not only here at home, but around the world. So I'm hoping that the opposition parties also will be supporting our Opposition Day motion today, which again reinforces the importance of Canadian agriculture, and the decisions that are impacting our farm families must be based on sound science and sound data. Instead of apologizing for the incredible achievements of Canadian agriculture, a Canadian government should be going around the world as proud as we can be and being a champion of what we do, not apologizing for it. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question and commentaire. The Honourable Member for Whitby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a great pleasure to serve on the same committee as the member opposite in Agriculture and Agri-Food Standing Committee. I wanted to ask the member, he mentioned in his speech about Sylvain Charlebois, who came before our committee, and who just the other day, very explicitly when asked a question about whether the price on pollution is affecting food price inflation, he said no. And so I wanted to just ask the member opposite if he recollects that. And then the other thing, I'll just add that the recent report done by the Canadian Climate Institute shows that there's going to be $25 billion in losses due to climate change by 2025, and that number is going to rise to $100 billion over the next 10, 15 years. So, and this actually undermines our entire growth of our economy. So how does the member reconcile that with the statements that he's made today?
Member for Foothills.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I do appreciate the question from my colleague. And again, at committee, their push is, we need to increase these carbon taxes to reach our climate change goals, but you won't have any farms left. No farms, no food. If you tax them into bankruptcy, then what? And the most frustrating part is they continue to ignore the accomplishments of Canadian farming in terms of our standings with emissions and carbon sequestration and stewardship and conservation. But you increase these carbon taxes and they haven't met a single target. If you were increasing these carbon taxes, as they say, this is the best way to meet our GHG emission goals, you haven't hit a single one. So the proof is in the pudding, Mr. Speaker. It doesn't work, and it's causing harm across Canada.
Question et commentaire, l'honorable député de Lac-Saint-Jean.
The honourable member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.